Hello children, this is No Cap Gaming, and in today's video I'm going to be listing the things that I believe Cyberpunk 2077 can do better than The Witcher 3. The Witcher 3 is a phenomenal game and probably my favorite game of all time. 4 years after its release, it still shines at the top as a prime example of what a single-player action-adventure RPG should look like. It does so many things right that it left me in awe after my first playthrough. The world is extraordinarily beautiful, the characters and their relationships have depth, the soundtrack is just perfect, and there's hundreds of hours of potential playtime to invest into amazingly crafted quests. But today we're obviously not talking about the strong points of The Witcher 3. There is no such thing as a perfect game, and therefore The Witcher naturally also has its flaws. Today we're talking about the weaker elements of The Witcher 3 and keeping our fingers crossed that CDPR has learned from player feedback and Cyberpunk 2077 improves upon these aspects. Without further ado, let's get into it. Number 4. Facial models. This one might be a minor thing for some, but although it doesn't affect gameplay itself in any way, it's a big immersion breaker for me. The Witcher 3 is notorious for its repeating facial features on different characters. This would sometimes confuse me, as I'd wonder if I'd met that person before because they look so similar to people Geralt's interacted with earlier in the game. Interacted being the key word here, as I don't really mind the general population having repeating features, whether it's their faces, clothing, or tattoos, but the characters you interact with, even the minor ones, should at least be unique enough that you don't confuse them with each other. I understand, however, that there are hardware limitations to this, and Night City is so much more populated than the world of The Witcher 3, it's just unrealistic to not expect to see any repeating elements whatsoever. But CDPR has noted in the past that they've greatly improved their crowd mechanics and facial animation system, so I hope facial variety comes with that as well. Cyberpunk also adds another layer of customization with the cybernetics, which can also act as unique features. If you've played The Witcher 3, you can't tell me that you don't absolutely despise the smug little face of this fucker. Number 3. Loot and weapon variety. This is one of the few obvious flaws in The Witcher 3. Most people that have played it, even casually, have had to notice at some point that the loot they get from defeating bosses, doing dungeons, and exploring is either way above their current level or way below. The latter one is particularly annoying in my opinion because the reward you get for the time and effort you've put into completing the task is completely useless. I remember defeating the first Wild Hunt warrior and that mission where he's left behind in a cave with you and Kara to kill you. The Wild Hunt was made to seem like scary and hugely powerful monsters prior to that, and that fight felt important. The dude looked like a beast and was swinging a giant axe. When I finished the fight, however, and expected to get his axe, or at least some nice armor, I went to loot him and found the Wild Hunt sword that was total garbage and unusable at that point in my gameplay. I've read that in the latest Cyberpunk demo that we'll get to see in about a month, V was able to pick up the actual hammer that the boss Sasquatch was wielding after they defeated her if they had enough strength. That detail alone made me so much more excited. I realized that what was missing in The Witcher 3 was weapon variety. I get it, the setting and the lore of The Witcher is different and much more restricting in comparison to Cyberpunk in terms of the weapons that can be included in the game. Even so, I still think CDPR didn't do as much as they could have to make loot and weapons feel more enjoyable and unique. The additional stats that weapons had were so minor that they were barely noticeable, and there weren't nearly as many handcrafted, unique pieces that there could have been. The swords you got through progressing the main story were great opportunities to make the player feel like they got something exclusive and premium, but fell apart once you actually got the item and realized it was weaker than something you looted from a random cave hours before.
My sword ready yet?
It is. Behold and admire. A sword to outshine all others.
Well, this was worth the wait. Thank you, Iber.
Not to mention how the crossbow, your only sidearm, is only useful underwater, and the axes you can pick up are totally basic and weak, making your only weapon of choice the sword. Yes, I'm the Witcher and I use swords, but I also want to have fun playing the game. The devs are definitely aware of these flaws though. Here's what UI designer Alvin Liu had to say about how Street Cred will solve the loot leveling problem.
Yeah, so some insight into kind of how games are developed. One thing that the game designers found a lot that happened in Witcher 3, if you played it, was that a lot of people were doing all the side missions because the side mission content was like really awesome. Like there was like really cool stories there. And then they were out leveling some sections, right? They sometimes got a reward, like, oh, but I'm already like 2 levels higher. So one of our approaches to handle that in Cyberpunk is that if you do a lot of these side optional missions, you earn street cred rather than your normal levels at a much different ratio. So the idea is that as you accomplish these missions in different districts, you'll be able to level up your street cred that way.
My understanding of this is that you'll earn street cred instead of your regular XP from side missions, so you won't be over leveled for your main quest. From what we've seen from Cyberpunk so far, we know that there's rarity levels and more hand-placed weapons, at least judging by the gameplay demo, so I'm pretty optimistic about them improving on this aspect. Number 2, difficulty. I loved my first encounter with the wolves in The Witcher 3. They absolutely decimated me in seconds. I felt like the wilderness that I had entered presented real actual danger, even for a Witcher. It felt good to encounter wolves later and tear them apart easily, but over time this became an apparent problem. I was vastly over-leveled for most of my encounters. No encounter had that same sense of danger anymore, and I get it, it doesn't make sense that a couple measly wolves present a real threat to an experienced Witcher who is used to hunting monsters throughout the entire game. But some difficulty scaling is probably necessary in an open world game like The Witcher 3. The game had an option to turn scaling on, but that only boosted enemies' stats. That's my biggest problem with The Witcher 3's difficulty settings. They only changed numbers under the hood. Something that had me a bit worried from the 2018 gameplay demo of Cyberpunk is how spongy V felt. She was absorbing bullets like it was nothing. This is one of my biggest pet peeves in games. Difficulty settings should not only change the HP and damage numbers for enemies like they did in The Witcher 3, but find other creative ways to make the game more or less challenging. Ideally, in my opinion, enemies should be able to kill you pretty quickly no matter your difficulty setting, so as to present an actual challenge that you could then choose to overcome in a harder or easier way. The challenge should still exist. Knowing that enemies can best you at any point throughout your entire gameplay gives you an incentive to prepare your gear in advance, think of the best strategy to use against certain opponent types, and focus more on playstyle and customization rather than sheer numbers. There's no reason for me to prepare my potions, bombs, and oils in advance in The Witcher 3 if I know that the number above the monster's head is lower than mine. I know that I don't need anything other than mine and my weapon's level to beat this opponent. That's because Geralt's base stats increase on every level up. I'd like to see these stats stay the same and power up by choosing where to invest my skill points, what cybernetics to install or not install, and picking the right weapons for the job. I understand that the balance of enjoyment for more skilled and more casual players is very difficult to achieve in such a huge game. We've seen smart guns with homing bullets, which are obviously easier to use and completely optional. That's one way of making the game easier for casual players. Cybernetics can also play a big part in this. I hope we see more of these in-game solutions that are a bit more creative than just plain number adjustments. And finally, number 1. Combat. To be honest, I didn't really mind The Witcher 3's combat, but I know that many people didn't enjoy it, and therefore I feel like I should talk about it. The main gripe people have with the combat is how repetitive it is. You cast Quen and spam light attack, dodge away, and repeat. This is how combat worked in nearly all encounters you had throughout the entire game. The other signs were useless or situational, heavy attack was useless, most of the skill tree branches were useless. I had to Google the use of adrenaline points to remind myself what they even did because in my multiple playthroughs I never paid attention to them once, and as I discussed previously, there wasn't enough weapon variety. Combat, however, is another thing that I feel optimistic about in Cyberpunk, although with a dose of caution. There's already countless more possibilities for weapons in the world of Cyberpunk compared to The Witcher, and there's also the whole concept of augmentations, which adds a whole other dimension to the game. People who've seen both of the gameplay demos all agree that the weakest link is gunplay, but this is something you can't really get a good feel for unless you try it out yourself. and there's lots of time to implement small tweaks like weapon sounds, recoil, and effective impact on enemies that could make a big difference to the overall feel. I'm a big sucker for mechanics that aren't announced to you as the player, but you're left to figure them out on your own. One such mechanic that I'm very excited about in Cyberpunk is the fact that firing animations will change as your skill grows. The recoil, precision, and reload speed will all improve over time as you use weapons more and more. I sent a question to the Cyberpunk Facebook page about ranged stealth weapons like bows, and I got a pretty vague response, but this is one more thing I'm hoping to see in the game. Bows are very present in the lore and could add a whole other playstyle to the game. All in all, I believe the biggest flaw of The Witcher 3's combat, which is repetitiveness, is already looking pretty unlikely judging by the sheer variety of weapons and possible playstyle options. Those were my picks for things I would like to see improved in Cyberpunk compared to The Witcher 3. Again, The Witcher 3 is my favorite game of all time, and I think it more than made up for its flaws in other areas, but pretending that it's perfect is just plain unrealistic.
This is Geralt, and you've just watched No Cap Gaming. Subscribe for more videos about Cyberpunk, and I love you.